The ship screamed as it fell through the atmosphere of Verath 9, and every soul on board knew they were about to die. Ambassador Scytha Vel gripped the armrest of her command seat with all four of her thin, insectoid hands, her translucent wings pressed flat against her back in pure terror, as the hull around her groaned and cracked like a dying animal. The emergency lights bathed everything in red, and the warning sirens would not stop howling, no matter how many times the crew tried to silence them. "We have lost the port engine," shouted Pollux, the Druvan engineer, his gelatinous body rippling with panic as he tried to hold onto his console, with limbs that were never designed for this kind of violence. "I can see that," snapped Lieutenant Drasso from across the bridge, the Korvathi security chief bracing himself against the wall with his thick reptilian tail, while his clawed hands worked the emergency systems. The planet below them was growing larger through the cracked viewport, a swirling mass of green and brown and deadly promise. Verath 9 was not a place anyone visited on purpose. It was classified as a quarantine world by the Galactic Union, a planet so hostile and so filled with apex predators that even unmanned probes had a survival rate of less than 30%. The jungle below was alive in the worst possible way, and now they were falling straight into it. "Brace for impact," Scytha commanded, her voice somehow steady, even though her entire body was trembling. The crash was violent and long and loud. Metal screamed against rock and wood and earth as the diplomatic vessel tore through the jungle canopy and carved a terrible scar across the surface of the planet, before finally grinding to a halt in a clearing of shattered trees and smoking debris. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence and the soft ticking of cooling metal. Then Scytha opened her eyes and looked around the ruined bridge. Pollux was alive, his body flattened against the floor like a puddle of pale blue gel, but already reforming into his usual shape. Drasso was bleeding from a cut above his eye, but was already on his feet, checking his sidearm with the calm efficiency of a soldier who had survived worse. 3 other crew members, 2 Zelkari technicians and a young Korvathi medic, were pulling themselves from the wreckage with shaking hands and wide eyes. But the pilot was gone. His seat was crushed beneath a collapsed beam, and Scytha did not need a medic to tell her what she already knew. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered a prayer in the old tongue of her people, before turning to face the survivors. "Status report," she said quietly. Pollux rippled over to the engineering console and pressed his membrane against the cracked display. "Main engines destroyed," he said, his voice a wet bubbling sound that the translator turned into flat words. "Communications array is offline. Life support is running on backup power, and we have approximately 72 hours of breathable atmosphere in the emergency reserves." "Weapons?" Drasso asked immediately. 2 plasma pistols and 1 rifle," said the Korvathi medic, a young female named Feska. "That is everything that survived the crash." Scytha nodded slowly and tried to think. They were stranded on one of the most dangerous planets in the known galaxy, with limited air, limited food, no way to call for help, and no way to leave. It was at that moment that a voice came from the back of the bridge, calm, unhurried, and oddly relaxed, given the circumstances. "Everybody alive up here?" Captain Jake Mercer stepped through the twisted doorway of the rear corridor, ducking his head to avoid a hanging cable. He was tall by human standards and average by Korvathi standards, with short dark hair and a face that always seemed to carry the faint ghost of a smile, even when nothing was funny. He had a bruise forming on his left cheek and a small cut on his forearm. But otherwise he looked completely unbothered by the fact that he had just survived a crash landing on a death world. The alien stared at him. Jake Mercer was the human. He was a military attaché assigned to the convoy, as part of humanity's recent induction into the Galactic Union, a species so new to galactic civilization that most Union citizens still did not know what a human looked like. The Zelkari considered them crude, but surprisingly resilient. The Druvan found them scientifically fascinating in the way one might find a particularly aggressive bacteria fascinating, and the Korvathi respected their combat ability, but thought they were reckless beyond reason. Jake had been polite and professional for the entire voyage, and the crew had treated him with the same cautious courtesy one might offer a large dog that had wandered into a formal dinner party. "We are alive, Captain Mercer," Scytha said carefully, "but we are in a very bad situation." Jake looked around the wrecked bridge and nodded. "Yeah, I can see that," he said simply, and then walked past them toward the main hatch. "Where are you going?" Drasso demanded, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Outside," Jake said over his shoulder. "Need to see what we are dealing with." "You cannot go outside," Scytha protested, standing from her seat with alarm buzzing through her wings. "This is Verath 9, Captain. Every creature on this planet is a predator, and the atmosphere alone is barely breathable for most species." Jake paused at the hatch and looked back at her with that ghost of a smile. "Good thing I am not most species," he said, and then he hit the release and stepped out into the alien air before anyone could stop him. Scytha stared at the open hatch in disbelief. Drasso let out a low growl that the translator rendered as a curse. "Humans," he muttered. Outside, Jake stood in the clearing and took a slow, deep breath. The air was thick and hot and tasted like copper and wet earth, but it was breathable, barely. He had grown up in the mountains of Montana back on Earth, and he had spent 3 years stationed on Mars before joining the diplomatic corps, so he knew what thin and bad air felt like, and this was far from the worst he had experienced. He looked around. The clearing was roughly 100 meters across, carved out by their crash landing, and the jungle pressed in from all sides like a living wall of green and black and deep shadow. The trees were enormous, taller than anything on Earth, with bark that looked like iron, and leaves that glowed faintly with bioluminescent chemicals as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains. It was beautiful, in the way that a loaded weapon was beautiful. Elegant and deadly and demanding respect. Jake walked slowly along the perimeter of the clearing, his boots crunching on alien soil, his eyes scanning every tree and every shadow. He was not just looking, he was reading. Years of survival training and a lifetime of hunting in the wilderness of Earth had taught him how to read a landscape the way other people read books. And what this landscape was telling him made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There were claw marks on the trees, not small ones, deep, deliberate gouges that ran from ground level to nearly 4 meters high, carved into the iron-hard bark with what must have been incredible force. They were territorial markers. Something very large and very powerful called this part of the jungle home, and their crash had just landed them right in the middle of its territory. Jake knelt beside one of the marks and ran his fingers along the groove. Fresh. No more than a day or two old. He stood and looked toward the darkening jungle, where the shadows between the massive trees were growing deeper by the minute, and strange sounds were beginning to echo through the canopy. Then it came. A roar. It started low like distant thunder rolling across the valley floor, and then it built and built and built until it became something physical, something that shook the ground beneath Jake's feet and rattled the wreckage of the ship behind him. Inside the ship, every alien froze. Theska dropped her medical kit. Palox flattened himself against the floor. Drasso drew his weapon with shaking hands. Scytha felt her wings go rigid, with a fear so deep it was almost ancestral, as if every generation of her species that had ever lived and died was screaming at her to run. But outside, Jake Mercer did not run. He closed his eyes and listened to the roar as it echoed across the valley and faded into the darkening sky. And when it was gone, he opened his eyes and looked toward the jungle with an expression that was not fear and not excitement, but something in between, something old and familiar and very, very human. "That is not hunting," he murmured to himself, as the last echoes died away, and the jungle fell into a heavy, watchful silence. "That is a warning." He turned and walked back toward the ship, and above him the alien stars began to appear one by one, in a sky that had never known the light of Earth's sun. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, something enormous shifted its weight, turned its 6 ancient eyes toward the clearing where the strange visitors had fallen from the sky, and began to move. Night fell on Vareth 9, like a curtain dropping over a stage, and with the darkness came a transformation that made every alien on the wrecked ship wish they had died in the crash instead. The jungle came alive. Not the gentle, whispering kind of alive that forests on civilized worlds offered. This was a savage, screaming, roaring kind of alive that pressed against the hull of the downed ship like a living nightmare, demanding to be let in. Bioluminescent fungi bloomed across the forest floor in waves of sickly green and cold blue, casting the jungle in an eerie glow that made every shadow look like it was moving, and many of them actually were. Strange calls echoed through the canopy, shrieks and howls and wet clicking sounds that no translator could identify, each one a reminder that Vareth 9 did not sleep at night, but instead woke up hungry. Inside the ship, the survivors huddled around the dim emergency lights and tried not to listen. Ambassador Scytha Vel sat in the captain's chair with her wings drawn tight around her body like a shield, reviewing what little data they had on the planet from the damaged computer banks. The information was not comforting. Vareth 9 hosted over 14,000 cataloged predator species, and the Union xenobiologists estimated that at least twice that number remained undiscovered. The planet had no herbivores in the traditional sense. Even the plants were predatory, and the fungi that lit the jungle floor were actually colonies of microscopic carnivores that dissolved organic matter on contact. Everything on this world was designed to kill, and the crash survivors were sitting in a broken metal box in the middle of all of it. "I have restored partial sensor capability," Palox announced from his station, his gelatinous body spread thin across the console so that his entire membrane could interface with the damaged systems. "But you are not going to like what I have found. Tell us," Scytha said. Palox hesitated, which was something Druven almost never did, and that alone was enough to make everyone in the room feel sick with dread. "There is a massive biological signature circling our position," he said. "It has been moving in a slow patrol pattern around the clearing for the past 2 hours, maintaining a distance of approximately 300 meters. "How massive?" Drasso asked, his hand already on his plasma rifle. Palox was quiet for a moment. 9 tons, he said. The silence that followed was absolute. "The database identifies it as a Vareth Dreadmaw," Palox continued, his translator rendering his words in a flat monotone that somehow made them even more terrifying. "It is the apex predator of the northern continent, 6 limbs, full body armor plating, rated at a hardness of 9 on the Korvathi mineral scale, tusks capable of shearing through ship-grade alloy, and a territorial aggression. Rating of Omega Black." Feska, the young Korvathi medic, looked up from her work with wide eyes. "Omega Black is the highest rating in the classification system," she whispered. "Yes," Palox confirmed unnecessarily. Drasso checked his plasma rifle with quick, practiced movements, but Jake noticed that the big reptilian soldier's hands were shaking just slightly. Barely enough to see, but enough for a human who had spent his life reading body language. "We have 2 pistols and 1 rifle," Drasso said. "If it attacks, I will hold it at the main hatch, while the rest of you retreat to the rear compartment." "That is a suicide plan," Scytha said flatly. "It is the only plan," Drasso replied. From the corner of the bridge where he had been sitting quietly on a piece of fallen bulkhead, Jake Mercer spoke up. "No, it is not." Everyone turned to look at him. Jake had been quiet since returning from his survey of the clearing. Apart from the group, and thinking in that still, focused way that the aliens found slightly unnerving. Humans did that sometimes. went completely still and silent for long periods, their eyes unfocused and their breathing slow, and it reminded the Korvathi uncomfortably of the way predators looked right before they struck. "Do not use the plasma weapons," Jake said calmly. Drasso's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "The blast will light up the jungle like a beacon," Jake said. "Every predator within 5 kilometers will come running to investigate, and if the Dreadmaw's armor can really stop ship-grade alloy like the database says, then all you are going to do is make it angry, and invite everything else on this planet to dinner." Drasso bristled, his scales rising along his neck in the Korvathi display of challenged authority. "And what do you suggest, human? That we sit here and wait for it to rip through the hull?" "I suggest we stay quiet and stay calm," Jake said. "That roar we heard earlier was a territorial warning, not a hunting call. It knows we're here, and it's deciding what to do about us." "You speak as if you understand the creature," Scytha said, studying the human with her large compound eyes. "I understand predators," Jake said simply. Before anyone could respond, the ship shuddered. Something outside had struck the ground hard enough to send a tremor through the earth itself, and every alien in the room went rigid with primal fear. Then came the sound, a deep rhythmic thudding that grew louder and louder, each impact heavy enough to rattle loose panels from the ceiling and send dust cascading from the cracks in the walls. It was footsteps. The Dreadmaw was coming. Pollux's sensors screamed warnings as the massive biological signature closed from 300 meters to 200 to 100 to 50. And then the clearing outside the ship exploded with noise and violence. Trees shattered, the ground shook, and something enormous tore through the jungle canopy and stepped into the clearing with the terrible authority of a god walking into a temple that belonged to it. Through the cracked viewports, the survivors got their first look at the Verath Dreadmaw, and several of them simply stopped functioning. Theska dropped to the floor and curled into a ball. One of the Zelkari technicians fainted outright. Even Drasso, a combat veteran of 3 border wars, took an involuntary step backward and felt his blood run cold in a way he had never experienced before. The creature was enormous, 9 tons of armored muscle and bone and fury that stood nearly 5 meters tall at the shoulder, on 6 massive limbs that ended in claws the size of combat knives. Its body was covered in interlocking plates of natural armor that gleamed like dark metal in the bioluminescent light, and its head was a nightmare of evolution, a broad, wedge-shaped skull with 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows of 3, each one glowing a deep and terrible amber in the darkness. Its tusks curved upward from its lower jaw like industrial shears, each one as long as Jake was tall, and between them was a mouth filled with teeth that were clearly not designed for chewing, but for destroying. The Dreadmaw planted its 6 feet in the center of the clearing and raised its massive head toward the wrecked ship. Then it opened its mouth and bellowed. The sound was not just loud, it was a physical force that hit the ship like a wall of compressed air, shattering the remaining viewport glass and sending everyone inside stumbling and grabbing for handholds. Scytha felt the roar in her bones, in her teeth, in every cell of her body, and something ancient and irreversible inside her brain told her, with absolute certainty, that she was in the presence of something that could not be fought, could not be outrun, and could not be reasoned with. "Open fire!" Drasso roared, raising his plasma rifle. "No!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. Drasso fired. The plasma bolt crossed the clearing in a flash of blue-white light and struck the Dreadmaw directly on its right shoulder plate. The bolt hit, flared, and bounced off like a spark off an anvil. The creature did not even flinch. It turned its 6 eyes toward the ship, and the amber glow in them shifted to a deep and furious red. It charged. The ground shook like an earthquake as 9 tons of apex predator surged forward with a speed that should have been impossible for something so large. And for one terrible moment, Every person on that ship knew with absolute clarity that they were about to be crushed into nothing. But then the Dreadmaw stopped. It skidded to a halt, less than 20 meters from the hull, its massive claws tearing furrows in the earth. And instead of attacking, it reared up on its 4 hind limbs and slammed its front 2 legs into the ground with enough force to crack the soil. Then it bellowed again, scraped the earth with its claws, and lowered its head in a posture that was pure dominance, a display of absolute territorial supremacy that said louder than any words could that this clearing and everything in it belonged to the Dreadmaw. Jake watched all of this from the viewport, with an expression that the aliens could not read. His eyes were locked on the creature, studying every movement, every shift of weight, every flare of its nostrils, and twitch of its armored tail. And in those movements he saw something that made him draw in a slow breath. The Dreadmaw was not attacking. It was not hunting. It was testing them, pushing to see what they would do, how they would react, whether they were prey or something else entirely. It was intelligent. Not intelligent like a person, but intelligent like a wolf, or a bear, or an elephant. Intelligent enough to think, to plan, to assess, and to decide. And that changed everything. Jake turned from the viewport and walked to the main hatch. "What are you doing?" Scytha demanded, her voice rising with alarm. Jake hit the hatch release. "Something stupid," he said quietly. The hatch opened with a groan of bent metal, and Jake Mercer stepped out into the clearing, alone and unarmed, and stood in the open air, less than 20 meters from the largest predator on Verath 9. Behind him, every alien on the ship pressed against the viewports and watched with a horror so deep it bordered on reverence. The Dreadmaw turned all 6 of its terrible eyes on the small, soft, unarmored creature that had just walked out of the metal shell. It huffed, a blast of hot air that hit Jake like a furnace wind, and carried the thick, wild scent of something ancient and powerful. Jake did not move. He stood perfectly still, with his hands at his sides and his feet planted on the alien soil, and his eyes locked on the glowing amber gaze of the Dreadmaw. The creature lowered its head until its tusks framed the human like the bars of a cage, and it growled, low and deep and endless, a sound that vibrated in Jake's chest and made his heart pound with the oldest fear that any living thing could feel. But Jake Mercer did not run. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He stood there in the darkness of a world that was not his own, face to face with a monster that could kill him with a single breath. And he held his ground. Because Jake Mercer was a human, and humans had been staring down predators since before they had learned to make fire. And somewhere deep in his blood, in the ancient code written by 1,000,000 years of survival on the most dangerous planet his species had ever known, something whispered to him that this moment was not the end. It was the beginning. The Dreadmaw's breath came in slow, heavy waves that washed over Jake like blasts from an open furnace, and each exhale carried the raw, primal scent of something that had never known fear in its entire existence. Jake stood motionless in the clearing, with the creature's massive head lowered to his level, its 6 glowing eyes studying him with an intensity that was almost thoughtful. And he did the one thing that every survival manual in the Galactic Union said you should never do when facing an Omega Black Predator. He stayed. Not because he was frozen with fear. He was afraid, deeply and honestly afraid, and his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. But because he recognized something in the way the creature was behaving that told him running would be the worst possible decision. The Dreadmaw was not in a killing posture. Its weight was distributed evenly across all 6 limbs, which meant it was balanced and grounded, rather than coiled to strike. Its tusks were raised slightly, rather than angled downward for a gore. And its growl, that deep and terrible vibration that shook the air between them, was steady and constant, rather than building. It was not a threat escalation, but a sustained communication. It was talking to him. Jake understood this not because he had studied alien biology, or because he had read it in a Union database, but because he had grown up on a world where humans had spent thousands upon thousands of years learning to read the language of dangerous animals. His grandfather had raised horses in Montana, and had taught Jake as a boy that a horse tells you everything about its mood with its ears and its eyes and the set of its shoulders before it ever makes a sound. His father had been a wildlife ranger who had once stood down a grizzly bear at 12 paces by reading the subtle shift in its stance that told him the charge was a bluff. And Jake himself had spent 2 years on a colonial survey mission on Kepler 442b, where the native predators communicated almost entirely through body posture and ground vibration. He knew this language. It was not words, and it was not logic. It was something older than both, written in the muscles and bones and breath of every predator that had ever lived, and Jake could read it like a native speaker. So he began to respond. Slowly, carefully, and with the absolute precision of someone who knew that a single wrong movement could end his life, Jake lowered his center of gravity. He did not crouch or kneel. That would have made him look like prey, something small and wounded and ready to be taken. But instead he widened his stance and bent his knees slightly, settling his weight into the ground the way a large animal would when signaling that it was calm and had no intention of fleeing. The Dreadmaw noticed. Its growl shifted, just barely, just a fraction of a tone, lower, and its 6 eyes blinked in a slow rolling sequence from left to right. Jake filed that away in his mind, and continued. He turned his head slightly to the side, breaking direct eye contact for a moment before returning to it, a gesture that in the body language of almost every predator species on Earth meant acknowledgement without submission, respect without surrender. The Dreadmaw tilted its enormous head, and for the first time since it had entered the clearing, its tusks lowered by a few degrees. Inside the wrecked ship, the aliens watched all of this through the shattered viewports with a mixture of terror and absolute incomprehension. "What is he doing?" Fesca whispered, her scales pale with fear. "I have no idea," Drasso said, his plasma rifle still raised, but his finger carefully off the trigger. "But he is still alive, so I am not going to interfere." Ambassador Scytha said nothing. She was staring at the scene outside, her compound eyes wide and unblinking, and her mind was racing because something about what she was witnessing was triggering a memory. A fragment from a briefing she had received before the voyage about the new species called humans and their homeworld called Earth. With trembling hands, she turned to the damaged computer console and pulled up the Galactic Union file on Homo sapiens. She had skimmed it before the mission, and had found it mildly interesting in the way that all new species files were mildly interesting. Another bipedal omnivore from another mid-range world. Nothing remarkable compared to the thousands of other sapient species in the Union. But now she read it again, carefully, and what she found made her blood go cold. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world. That alone was unusual. Most sapient species evolved on worlds rated Class 4 through Class 7, comfortable planets with stable climates and manageable biospheres. Nightmare of extreme weather, tectonic instability, megapredators, toxic flora, and a biosphere so aggressively competitive that extinction events had wiped out the majority of life on the planet, not once, but 5 separate times. And humans had not just survived on this world, they had conquered it. But the detail that made Scytha's wings go rigid and her heart's beat in a stuttering rhythm was buried deep in the cultural and behavioral section of the file, in a passage that some Union anthropologist had clearly written with a sense of bewildered fascination. Humans formed symbiotic bonds with predators. It was written right there in plain text, and Sci-Fi read it 3 times because she could not believe what she was seeing. Throughout their evolutionary history, humans had taken the most dangerous animals on their planet, and instead of avoiding them or exterminating them, had deliberately sought them out, studied them, earned their trust, and transformed them into partners and companions. They had taken wolves, pack-hunting apex predators with powerful jaws and killing instincts, and over generations of patient interaction had turned them into dogs, loyal creatures that lived alongside humans in their homes and protected their children. They had taken wild horses, massive, powerful, easily spooked prey animals that could crush a human with a single kick, and had learned to ride them, forming a partnership so effective that it had changed the course of their civilization. They had trained birds of prey to hunt for them, elephants to work alongside them, dolphins to assist them in the water, and even large cats to guard their homes. No other sapient species in the entire Galactic Union had ever done anything even remotely like this. The Zelkari had evolved on a calm, temperate world with no large predators, and had developed intelligence through social complexity and communication. Predators themselves, but had never bonded with other predator species. They had simply outcompeted them. The Druvan had no concept of animal companionship whatsoever. But humans had looked at the most terrifying creatures on their hellish planet, and had somehow decided that the correct response was not to fight them or flee from them, but to befriend them. Scytha looked up from the screen and stared through the viewport at Jake Mercer, who was now slowly, impossibly slowly, raising his right hand toward the Dreadmaw, with his palm open and his fingers relaxed. "He is not being reckless," she whispered, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. He knows exactly what he is doing. Outside, Jake extended his open hand toward the Dreadmaw's massive snout and held it there, steady and still, offering it the way you would offer your hand to a strange dog, not pushing forward, not retreating, just presenting it as an invitation. Went very still. Its growl faded to a low rumble, and its 6 eyes focused on the small, pale shape of the human's hand, with an intensity that seemed to bend the air around them. Seconds passed. Each one felt like a year. Jake kept his breathing slow and even, kept his hands steady, kept his body language open and calm, and waited. The Dreadmaw leaned forward, its nostrils flared as it drew in the scent of this strange creature, this small, soft, unarmored thing that stood before it, without fear and without weapons, and offered its bare hand to a mouth that could crush starship hull. It sniffed once, twice, 3 times, and then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so massive and so powerful, the Dreadmaw pressed its enormous snout against Jake's open palm. Jake exhaled. His hand did not tremble. He could feel the creature's warmth through its armored skin, could feel the slow rhythm of its breathing, could feel the vibration of its heartbeat, deep and steady and ancient, the heartbeat of something that had ruled this jungle for longer than his entire species had existed. And he began to talk. Not in any language the Dreadmaw could understand, not in words that carried meaning or syntax or grammar, but in a low, steady, rhythmic murmur that carried something far more important than meaning. It carried tone. It carried calm. It carried the simple, ancient message that every human who had ever gentled a wild horse, or calmed a frightened dog, or earned the trust of a wild wolf, knew by instinct. I am here. I am not a threat. I see you, and I am not afraid. Jake moved his hand slowly along the Dreadmaw's snout to the side of its jaw, where the armor plating thinned, and the skin beneath was tough but sensitive, and he scratched gently along the ridge, where bone met muscle. The Dreadmaw made a sound. It was not a growl, and it was not a roar, and it was not a... It was a low, rolling, resonant rumble that came from deep in the creature's chest and vibrated through its entire body, and through Jake's hand and up his arm and into his own chest, where it settled like a warm stone. It was a purr. Inside the ship, Palox pressed his membrane against the viewport and watched with every sensory cell in his body. "He is bonding with it," he whispered, and his voice was thick with something that might have been awe, or might have been horror, or might have been both. Drasso stood behind him, the plasma rifle hanging forgotten at his side, his amber reptilian eyes wide and his mouth slightly open in an expression that no Korvathi would ever willingly show in front of another species. "What kind of creature," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "looks at an omega black predator and sees a friend?" Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. Outside, the Dreadmaw slowly lowered its massive body to the ground, tucking its 6 limbs beneath it the way a resting animal does when it feels safe. And Jake settled down beside it, with his back against its warm armored flank, and his hand resting on its neck. The creature rumbled again, that deep, contented purr, and turned one of its 6 great eyes toward the human, with an expression that was impossible to name, but impossible to mistake. Trust. Jake Mercer sat in the darkness of an alien world, with his hand on the neck of the most dangerous creature on the planet, and he looked up at the unfamiliar stars with a quiet, tired smile. And inside the ship, Ambassador Scytha Vel looked at the Galactic Union file, still glowing on her screen, and she understood for the first time that humanity was not what the galaxy thought it was. They were not just tough, not just stubborn, not just survivors from a dangerous world. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. Terrifying in equal measure. They were the species that made friends with monsters. Dawn broke over Verath 9 like a wound opening in the sky, spilling thick golden light through the jungle canopy, and painting the clearing in shades of amber and deep green. Jake woke with his back still pressed against the warm, armored flank of the Dreadmaw, and for a moment he simply sat there and listened to the massive creature's slow, rhythmic breathing, as the forest around them stirred with the sounds of a new and dangerous day. The Dreadmaw was still resting beside him, its 6 eyes half closed in a state that was not quite sleep, but not quite waking. The relaxed alertness of an apex predator that feared nothing and could afford to rest without ever truly letting its guard down. Jake placed his hand on its neck and felt the deep rumble of its heartbeat beneath the armor plating, steady and strong and impossibly old. "Morning, big guy," he murmured. The creature opened 2 of its eyes and regarded him with what Jake had come to recognize as version of mild curiosity. A slow blink followed by a soft huff of warm air. Jake patted its neck twice and stood, stretching muscles that were stiff from a night spent sleeping on alien ground, and walked toward the ship. Inside, the survivors were already awake, and looking like they had not slept at all. Scytha was at the command console reviewing data with the focused intensity of someone who was using work to keep panic at bay, and Drasso was pacing the length of the bridge with his tail swishing in the agitated pattern that meant he was angry and scared and did not know what to do about either. Palox was spread across the engineering station like a thin blue blanket, and the way his membrane was flickering suggested he had been working through the night. He looked up as Jake entered and spoke without preamble. "I have bad news." "Just the one kind?" Jake asked. "The communications array is beyond repair with the tools and materials we have available," Palox said. "I have tried every configuration I can think of, and the damage is simply too extensive. The main transmitter coil is shattered, the signal amplifier is fused, and even if I could fix both, The power output from our backup systems would not be strong enough to reach any Union relay station. The room was quiet for a moment as that sank in. Without communications, they could not call for rescue, and without rescue, they would be dead in less than 60 hours when the emergency air supply ran out. However, Palox continued, and the slight ripple of hope in his membrane was enough to make everyone lean forward. The Union maintains a network of emergency relay beacons on quarantined worlds for exactly this kind of situation. Automated stations that can boost a distress signal to reach the nearest patrol fleet. And there is one on this planet? Sci-Fi asked. There is, Palox said, pulling up a map on the cracked display. Survey outpost, approximately 40 kilometers east of our position. Abandoned decades ago, but equipped with a beacon that should still be functional. These beacons are designed to operate independently for centuries. 40 kilometers, Drasso said, and the way he said it made it sound like 40,000. Through the most hostile jungle on a quarantined death world, filled with predators that make the Dreadmaw look like a household pet. The Dreadmaw is actually the apex predator of this region, Palox corrected. Nothing here is larger or more dangerous. That does not make me feel better, Drasso said. On foot, the journey would take approximately 2 days, Palox said, assuming optimal conditions, no hostile encounters, and a pace that most of our species can sustain. We do not have 2 days, Scytha said quietly, and optimal conditions on Verath 9 is a phrase that has no meaning. The room fell silent again, and in that silence, everyone slowly became aware that Jake Mercer was standing very still near the viewport, looking out at the clearing where the Dreadmaw rested in the morning light. He had that expression on his face again, the one the aliens could not read, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite determination, but something in between that seemed to come from a place inside him that no other species could access. I can make it in half a day, he said. Every head in the room turned to face him. That is not possible, Palox said flatly. Even for a human, 40 kilometers through that jungle on foot would take. I did not say on foot, Jake said. He turned from the viewport and looked at Scytha, and something in his eyes, something calm and certain and slightly wild, made the ambassador's wings flutter with an emotion she could not name. No, Drasso said, because he understood before anyone else what the human was suggesting. Only way, Jake said. You want to ride that thing? Drasso's voice rose to a pitch that his translators struggled to render. You want to climb on the back of a 9-ton Omega Black Predator and ride it through 40 kilometers of Death World jungle like some kind of... He did not finish the sentence because no Korvathi word existed for what he was trying to describe. Jake was already moving. He walked to the emergency supply locker and began pulling out lengths of the crash webbing, the strong, flexible straps that had been designed to secure cargo during flight, and started fashioning them into something with quick, practiced hands. The aliens watched in stunned silence as the shape of what he was making became clear. It was a harness. A riding harness. This is insanity, Drasso said, but his voice had lost its edge and been replaced by something that sounded almost like awe. Probably, Jake agreed without looking up, watched him work, and felt something shifting inside her understanding of the universe. A fundamental recalibration of what she thought was possible and what she thought was sane. Captain Mercer, she said carefully, even if the creature allows you to mount it, you will be alone in the most dangerous wilderness in this sector, with no weapons, no backup, and no guarantee that the beacon is still functional. Jake finished the harness, tested its strength with a sharp pull, and slung it over his shoulder. Ambassador, he said, and his voice was gentle but firm. I grew up riding horses through mountain passes in a snowstorm. My species has been climbing onto the backs of large, dangerous animals and convincing them to take us where we need to go for about 6,000 years. He paused and looked at her with that ghost of a smile. This is what we do, Then he walked out of the ship and into the clearing where the Dreadmaw was waiting. Lifted its massive head as Jake approached, its 6 eyes tracking him with that calm, assessing intelligence that had replaced the aggression of the night before. Jake spoke to it in a low, steady voice, meaningless words delivered in a tone that carried meaning beyond language, and walked slowly along its flank, letting his hand trail across the worn armor plating so the creature could feel his presence and his intent. He found the spot he had been looking for, a natural depression between the 2 largest dorsal plates on the creature's upper back, where the armor curved inward and created a space almost perfectly shaped for a human body to sit. It was as if millions of years of evolution had accidentally built a saddle into the Dreadmaw's spine. Jake placed the harness across the creature's back, moving slowly and deliberately, talking all the while in that calm, rhythmic murmur. The Dreadmaw rumbled, but did not move. It turned one great eye back to watch what the human was doing, and when Jake tightened the first strap around the base of a dorsal plate, the creature huffed once and then settled, accepting the strange new sensation with a patience that would have been unthinkable to any alien watching. And then Jake mounted. He placed his hands on the harness grips, put his foot on the creature's bent foreleg, and swung himself up onto the Dreadmaw's back in one smooth motion that spoke of a species that had been doing exactly this kind of thing since before it had invented writing. The aliens at the viewport made sounds that their translators could not process, gasps and clicks and involuntary vocalizations that came from the deepest parts of their evolutionary programming. Scytha's translator searched its entire database for a word to describe what she was witnessing, and came back empty. There was no word in any Galactic Union language for a person riding a monster. Jake settled into the natural saddle between the dorsal plates, adjusted his grip on the harness, and pressed his knees against the creature's sides. The Dreadmaw rose. 9 tons of armored apex predator stood up with Jake Mercer on its back, and the ground trembled beneath its 6 massive feet, and the jungle fell silent, as if every creature for a kilometer in every direction had sensed that something unprecedented was happening. Jake leaned forward and placed his hand on the Dreadmaw's neck. "Let us go, big guy," he whispered. He squeezed his knees and shifted his weight forward, and the Dreadmaw responded as if it had been waiting for exactly this signal, from exactly this rider, for its entire ancient life. It charged. The world became a blur of green and gold and thundering power as the Dreadmaw surged forward into the jungle at a speed that defied its massive size, its 6 legs driving it through the dense undergrowth like a living battering ram. Twigs. Undergrowth was flattened into nothing. The ground shook with every stride, and Jake held on with his legs and his hands and his entire body, leaning with the creature's movements the way a rider leans with a galloping horse, becoming part of the animal rather than fighting against it. They were one, human and beast, rider and mount, 2 predators from 2 different worlds moving together through the hostile jungle of Vareth 9, with a speed and power that nothing on the planet could match. Lesser predators scattered before them. Creatures that would have torn the alien crew apart in seconds fled at the sound of the Dreadmaw's approach, crashing through the undergrowth, in desperate retreat from the undisputed king of the jungle. A pack of 6-legged hunters that had been stalking something in the shadows took one look at the charging Dreadmaw and vanished into the canopy like smoke. A massive serpentine creature coiled around a tree trunk, unwound itself, and slithered away so fast it left gouges in the bark. Nothing challenged the Dreadmaw, and nothing challenged the thing riding it. Jake navigated by the cracked datapad strapped to his forearm, calling out adjustments in direction with shifts of his weight and gentle pressure of his knees. And the Dreadmaw responded to each cue with an intuitive understanding that went beyond training or obedience. It was cooperation, pure and simple, 2 intelligent beings working together toward a common purpose. They forded a river of dark water, where something massive lurked beneath the surface, and the Dreadmaw plowed through without slowing, while the underwater predator wisely chose not to test the largest thing in the jungle. From somewhere so deep in his human soul that it had no name, they barreled through a nest of venomous creatures that boiled out of the ground in a writhing mass of legs and stingers, and the Dreadmaw simply roared, a sound so powerful that the swarm dispersed like leaves in a hurricane, and kept running. 40 kilometers of Deathworld jungle. 40 kilometers of the most hostile terrain the galaxy had to offer. And Jake Mercer crossed it in 4 hours on the back of a monster that the entire Galactic Union had classified as untouchable. The outpost appeared through the thinning jungle like a ghost from another age, a crumbling Union structure, half swallowed by vegetation, its walls cracked and its equipment corroded by decades of neglect. But the beacon towers still stood, and when Jake dismounted and climbed through the overgrown entrance, and found the emergency console and pressed his hand against the activation panel, the beacon responded with a clear, strong pulse of light that shot upward through the canopy and into the sky like a spear thrown at the stars. The distress signal was away. Jake walked back outside and stood in the morning light beside the Dreadmaw, who had settled onto the ground beside the outpost, as naturally as a horse waiting outside a barn. He put his hand on the creature's neck and felt its heartbeat, steady, calm, untroubled, and he smiled. "Good ride," he said softly. The Dreadmaw rumbled in response, and together they waited on the ridge as the beacon pulsed above them, a human and a monster silhouetted against the alien sky. And in that moment, they were the most powerful thing on the entire planet. The Galactic Union Rescue Fleet arrived 6 hours after the beacon fired, and when the first dropship broke through the cloud cover above Verath 9, the soldiers aboard were expecting to find bodies. That was the standard outcome on quarantined worlds: wreckage, remains, and a report filed under the category of unfortunate loss that would sit in the Union archives, gathering dust alongside thousands of others just like it. Nobody survived Verath 9. That was not an opinion or a statistic, but a fact so well established that the rescue commander, Admiral Vorath Kess of the Korvathi Third Fleet, had already drafted the condolence letters during the flight, and had mentally prepared himself for the grim task of recovering whatever was left of the diplomatic crew. So when the dropship descended through the jungle canopy, and the scanners revealed not a field of wreckage and death, but a clearing full of living, breathing survivors standing in the open air of the most dangerous planet in the sector, Admiral Cass felt his scales rise in a pattern that indicated extreme confusion. And then the forward cameras focused, and he saw what was in the clearing with them, and his confusion turned into something he had no name for. A Verith Dreadmaw, a 9-ton Omega Black apex predator, the single most dangerous creature cataloged in the Union biological database, was sitting in the clearing like a resting pack animal, and a human was perched on its back. The bridge of the dropship went completely silent. "Admiral," said his communications officer in a voice that had gone very small, "are you seeing this?" "I am seeing it," Kess said slowly. "I am choosing not to believe it, but I am seeing it." The dropship landed at the far edge of the clearing, and the rescue team deployed in full combat formation. 20 Korvathi Marines in heavy armor, with plasma rifles raised and shield generators humming, prepared for the worst that Verath 9 could throw at them. They were not prepared for what they actually found. Jake Mercer sat atop the Dreadmaw, with one hand resting casually on the creature's neck, looking for all the world like a man sitting on a porch watching the sunset, rather than a lone human mounted on a living nightmare. The alien survivors stood near the wreckage of their ship, alive and unharmed if visibly shaken, and they were all staring at Jake, with expressions that ranged from lingering disbelief to something that looked very much like worship. Admiral Kess stepped off the dropship ramp, took 3 steps into the clearing, looked up at Jake on the Dreadmaw, and stopped. He was a veteran of 40 years of military service. He had fought in 3 wars, survived 2 assassination attempts, and once personally held a breached airlock with nothing but a combat knife and sheer Korvathi stubbornness. But nothing in his long and violent career had prepared him for the sight of a human riding a Dreadmaw. He stared for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, the single word that every species in the galaxy eventually learned to say when confronted with something a human had done. Humans. Jake smiled that ghost of a smile, and slid down from the Dreadmaw's back with the easy grace of a dismounting rider. Admiral, he said with a nod. Thanks for coming. You are riding a Dreadmaw, Kess said flatly. Was riding, Jake corrected. I think the ride is over now. He turned back to the creature and placed both hands on its massive snout, and the Dreadmaw pressed into his touch with that low, rumbling purr that had so terrified the aliens the night before, but now sounded like nothing more than what it was, the contented sound of a powerful animal that had found something it trusted. Time to go home, big guy, Jake said softly. The Dreadmaw huffed, and its 6 eyes blinked in that slow rolling pattern that Jake had learned meant acknowledgement, and for a moment the human and the creature simply stood together in the golden morning light of Vareth 9, sharing a silence that needed no words. Then Jake stepped back, and the Dreadmaw rose to its full height. 9 tons of armor and muscle, and ancient, terrible beauty, and turned toward the jungle. It paused at the tree line and looked back. One of its 6 great eyes found Jake across the clearing, and it held him in its gaze for a long, still moment that made everyone watching feel as though they were witnessing something private and sacred. A farewell between 2 beings who had understood each other in a way that transcended species and language, and everything the galaxy thought it knew about the relationship between predator and prey. The Dreadmaw bellowed, not the earth-shaking roar of territorial fury that had first announced its presence, and not the ground-splitting battle cry of a charging apex. Predator. This was something different, something lower and longer and shot through with a resonance that vibrated in every chest in the clearing. It sounded like mourning. It sounded like goodbye. And then the Dreadmaw turned and disappeared into the jungle, and the trees swallowed it whole, and the last trace of the most dangerous creature on Vareth 9 was the fading tremor of its footsteps in the earth beneath their feet. Jake watched it go and said nothing. Aboard the rescue cruiser in orbit, the debriefing lasted 4 hours. Sitha delivered her report to a room full of military officers, intelligence analysts, and union officials, and she spoke with the measured precision of a veteran diplomat who had given hundreds of briefings in her career. But this briefing was different. This time her voice carried an undertone of something that had not been there before. A quiet, almost reverent gravity that made everyone in the room sit straighter and listen harder. She described the crash, the damage, the hopelessness of their situation, and the arrival of the Dreadmaw with clinical accuracy. But when she reached the part where Jake walked out of the ship unarmed and alone to face the creature, she paused. It was a long pause, and in it the room held its breath. He did not fight it, Sitha said, and her words were slow and careful, as if she was handling something fragile. He did not try to kill it, or scare it, or drive it away. He walked up to the most dangerous animal on the planet, and he stood there, and he read its body language, the way I would read a diplomatic communique. And then he reached out his hand, and he touched it. She paused again, and it let him. The room was silent. I reviewed the Union file on humanity after witnessing this, Sitha continued, and I found something that I believe the Galactic Union has dramatically underestimated in its assessment of this species. She activated a display behind her that showed a series of images from Earth's history, ancient cave paintings of humans and wolves hunting side by side, historical illustrations of cavalry charges with humans mounted on massive war horses, photographs of falconers with birds of prey perched on their arms, footage of elephant handlers working alongside creatures that outweighed them by a factor of 100. Humans do not merely coexist with predators, Sitha said. They bond with them. They form deep, lasting, symbiotic relationships with the most dangerous animals on their world, turning enemies into allies and threats into partners through a process of patient communication, mutual respect, and what their species calls trust. She let the images cycle through the display. Wolves becoming dogs, wild horses becoming war horses, birds of prey becoming hunting partners, dolphins working alongside fishermen. Admirals and analysts and officials watched in absolute silence as image after image showed the same impossible pattern. Humans standing beside creatures that should have killed them, working with them, living with them, riding them into battle and into history. No other sapient species in the Union has ever demonstrated this capability, Sitha said. Not one. In 12,000 years of recorded galactic history, across over 400 sapient species, no civilization has ever formed voluntary cooperative bonds with apex predators. She paused and looked around the room. Until now. The briefing ended in silence, and the silence followed Sitha all the way back to her quarters, where she sat alone and stared out the viewport at the stars, and tried to process what she had experienced on the surface of Verath 9. 3 weeks later, Ambassador Sitha Vel stood at the central podium of the Galactic Union Council Chambers, the largest diplomatic assembly in known space, a vast amphitheater of carved stone and floating light platforms, where representatives from over 400 species gathered to debate the fate of civilization. She had been invited to deliver a special address regarding the Verath 9 incident, and as she looked out at the thousands of faces, insectoid, reptilian, gelatinous, crystalline, gaseous, and 100 other forms of life that the galaxy had produced in its long and strange history, she felt the weight of what she was about to say settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. "Honored delegates," she began, and her voice carried across the vast chamber with a clarity that silenced every murmur and stilled every movement. 3 weeks ago, I survived a crash landing on Verath 9, a world that this assembly classified as uninhabitable and quarantined from all contact because of the extreme danger posed by its native predators. She paused and let the weight of that statement sink in. Survived because of a human. The chamber stirred, a ripple of murmurs and clicking and vibrations, as 400 species reacted to the word that had been generating more and more discussion in Union circles since humanity's recent induction. When our ship fell, Sitha continued, and we found ourselves stranded on a world of monsters with no hope of rescue, it was the human among us, Captain Jake Mercer, who saved us, and he did so in a way that I believe this assembly must understand, because it reveals something about humanity that we have failed to recognize. She brought up the image of the dread maw on the display behind her, all 9 tons of armored fury, captured by the ship's external cameras in the moment it had first entered the clearing. The chamber reacted, gasps, involuntary movements of retreat, pheromonal alarm signals from a dozen different species. "This is a Verath Dreadmaw," Sitha said. "Omega Black classification, the highest. Predator threat rating in our system. An animal so dangerous that the standard Union protocol upon encountering one is immediate evacuation by any means necessary." She paused. Captain Mercer walked up to it, unarmed, touched it with his bare hand, and 24 hours later rode it 40 kilometers through the jungle to activate the beacon that saved all of our lives. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped in a dozen languages: disbelief, shock, denial, demands for evidence. and Scytha waited calmly until the noise subsided before she played the footage. The room watched in absolute silence as the external cameras showed Jake standing alone in the clearing, facing down the Dreadmaw, reaching out his hand, making contact, sitting beside it through the night, fashioning the harness, mounting the creature, and riding it into the jungle at full gallop. When the footage ended, the chamber was so quiet that Scytha could hear the hum of the light platforms. Above her, "We have made a mistake," she said, and her voice was soft, but it carried to every corner of that enormous room. "When humanity joined the Union, we assess them as we assess all new species, by their technology, their military capacity, their economic potential, and their threat level. And by those metrics, we judge them to be a moderately advanced, physically resilient, and somewhat aggressive species from an unusually hostile homeworld." She shook her head slowly. "We were wrong, not about the facts, but about what those facts meant." She took a breath. "We feared the Dreadmaw because it was a monster, because every instinct we possess, every evolutionary lesson written in our blood, told us that a creature like that exists only to be avoided, fled from, or destroyed." She looked out at the assembly with eyes that had seen something on Verath 9 that she would never forget. The human did not tame the Dreadmaw because he was stronger. He tamed it because he looked at a monster and chose to understand it. Her voice rose, clear and strong, and carrying a conviction that was absolute. "That is what humans do. They do not conquer the darkness. They walk into it, sit down beside it, and make it their companion." She paused for the last time, and when she spoke again, her words fell into the silence of the chamber like stones into still water. "And that, honored delegates, is why humanity is the most dangerous species this galaxy will ever know. Not because they fight the monsters, but because the monsters fight for them." The chamber was silent. 400 species, thousands of delegates, the collected wisdom and power and fear of an entire galaxy, and not one of them made a sound. Then it began. Not applause, because most species in the Union did not applaud, but something deeper and more universal, a ripple of acknowledgement that moved through the assembly like a wave, expressed in 100 different ways by 100 different biologies, but all carrying the same unmistakable message: respect. Not comfort, not warmth, not the easy camaraderie of allies who understood each other, but an undeniable core of respect. Other, but a deep, unsettled, almost fearful respect for a species that the galaxy was only now beginning to truly see. And far away, on a quarantined planet that the Union had written off as a world of nothing but death, a Dreadmaw lifted its massive head from the jungle floor and turned its 6 ancient eyes toward the sky. A faint contrail was fading among the stars, the last trace of the ship that had carried the strange, small, fearless creature away from this world and back to wherever such beings came from. The Dreadmaw watched the contrail disappear. Then it rumbled once, low and long and resonant, a sound that carried through the jungle and silenced every other voice for a kilometer in every direction. And then it turned and walked back into the dark, and the jungle closed behind it like a door, and Verath 9 was as it had always been, wild and savage and unconquered. But something had changed. Something small and invisible and permanent had been left behind in the space between the trees where a human had once sat beside a monster and earned its trust.